electrophysiology of the heart. The student will be, after end of this class, the student will be able to draw the labeled diagrams of fast and slow response of action potential and give their ionic basis, give the ionic basis of pacemaker potential, explain the effects of sympathetic and vagal stimulation of pacemaker potential. Now, action potentials in cardiac muscle. There, the slow response action potential occurs in the nodal tissue, that is SA node and AV node. Fast response action potential occurs in arterial and ventricular muscles and Purkinje fibers. Now, phases and the ionic basis, the 5 phases 0 to 4. Phase 0, this is the phase of rapid depolarization and the overshoot. As the membrane potential reaches the threshold, rapid depolarization occurs due to rapid entry of sodium ions. In fact, immediately above the threshold level of the membrane potential, sodium channels that were activated initially activate other sodium channels, hence called auto-activation of sodium channels that results in manifold opening of the channels. Phase 1, this is the phase of initial rapid repolarization. This phase of partial repolarization is due to closure of sodium channels, that is the cessation of sodium influx, opening up outward transient rectifying potassium channel that causes transient outflux of potassium also partly contributes, and this potassium current is activated by depolarization and is rapidly inactivated. Phase 2, this is known as plateau phase, as the action potential in this phase remains in a state of sustained depolarization. This phase is due to sustained increased permeability of the membrane to calcium ions through slowly opening calcium channels, and that results in slow calcium influx. Efflux of potassium ions contributes to maintain sustained depolarization. The plateau phase is of much lesser duration in arterial muscle than the ventricular muscles. Then the phase 3, this is the phase of final repolarization. This occurs due to cessation of calcium influx and increased potassium efflux. This phase is mainly due to opening of outward delayed rectifying potassium channels. Phase 4, this is the phase of restoration of membrane potential. The membrane permeability to potassium is restored towards the resting value. Opening of the inward rectifying potassium channels contributes to maintain the restored membrane potential. Then slow response action potential, that is phase 0. Phase 0 of slow response action potential, it occurs due to opening of calcium channels. The depolarization is mainly due to influx of calcium ions through the long-acting calcium channels, L calcium channels. Therefore, depolarization wave rises slowly. Phase 3, this phase is due to closure of calcium channels and opening of potassium channels, increased potassium efflux. Phase 4, this is the phase of slow diastolic depolarization. The early part of this phase is due to the closure of potassium channels, decreased potassium conductance. Later part is due to opening of transient calcium channels, T calcium channels. Calcium sparks release of calcium locally from sarcoplasmic reticulum also contributes. Then coming to the pacemaker potential. The pacemaker of the heart, that is the SA node, discharges rhythmically and automatically. The automaticity is due to spontaneous diastolic depolarization of the membrane potential following completion of each action potential. The resting diastolic membrane potential that depolarizes is called the pre-potential, as it brings the membrane potential to the threshold level, which then triggers the action potential. The pre-potential is known as pacemaker potential. Then ionic basis. In the initial part, the repolarization phase of the action potential in the nodal tissues is due to efflux of potassium ions. At the peak of each action potential, potassium conductance begins. Towards the end of repolarization, the IK, that is the potassium conductance, declines, which is known as potassium decay. At this moment, the F channels open and the IH increases. Okay. Now these events allow they allow membrane to depolarize. Thus, the potassium decay and IH contribute to the initial part of pacemaker potential. In the latter part of the pacemaker potential is due to the opening of transient calcium channels. The entry of calcium through the T channel completes the pacemaker potential and takes the membrane potential to the threshold level, which then fires to form the action potential. The upstroke of the action potential occurs due to opening of the long-lasting calcium channels. Then other ions, recently it has been suggested that the calcium sparks release of calcium locally from sarcoplasmic reticulum also contribute to the pacemaker potential. Contribution of sodium ion is linked to the IH. Thus the pacemaker potential is largely due to decay of the potassium influx and IH, the initial part, and influx of calcium, the later part. Effect of vagal stimulation. Heart rate is decreased because of membrane is hyperpolarized and the slopes of the prepotential is decreased, becomes relatively flat. This occurs due to release of acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nerve endings. Acetylcholine increases the potassium conductance and delays the potassium decay. Mechanisms. Acetylcholine acts by two mechanisms: by directly acting on potassium channels and by acting on the M2 receptors. Acetylcholine directly acts on the G protein activated potassium channel that produces G protein current, thus it increases potassium conductance. Acetylcholine acting on M2 muscarinic receptors stimulates the subunits of G protein, which in turn activates the potassium channels. It counters the decay of potassium and hyperpolarizes the membrane during phase 4 that slows the pacemaker potential. Acetylcholine also by acting on the M2 muscarinic receptors on the SA node decreases the concentration of cyclic AMP in the cells, that in turn decreases the opening of the calcium channels. This decreases calcium influx via T-type calcium channels that decreases the slope of prepotential and takes the membrane potential away from threshold level, therefore heart rate decreases. The decrease in the intracellular calcium concentration also decreases the force of contraction. However, vagal stimulation mainly affects the rate rather than the force of contraction because ventricles have sparse vagal innervation. Effect of sympathetic stimulation. The sympathetic stimulation of the heart increases the heart rate and force of contraction. Mechanisms. The slope of prepotential becomes steeper so that the threshold level is reached earlier than the normal, which increases the heart rate. This occurs due to the release of norepinephrine at the sympathetic nerve ending. Norepinephrine binds to beta 1 receptors, which increases the intracellular cyclic AMP, that in turn increases the opening of the calcium channels and causes calcium influx. The membrane is rapidly depolarized to the firing level and the depolarization phase of the action potential becomes steeper, thus heart rate increases. The increase in the intracellular calcium ion in the ventricular myocytes increases the force of contraction.